because my brother and I were friends until he went off to college and left me home alone. We had been in the UP up in Gwinn, Michigan at K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base, and we had actually been there for 4 years, the longest I had been at any location in my entire life up to that point. I'm not exaggerating when I say on the very first day of my senior year, I'd been there 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade. I was so excited to go start my senior year because I knew everybody in this town, everybody knew me. On the very first day, I came home from school on my senior year, and my mom said, "You better sit down," and the first thing out of my mouth was, "Oh crap," because I knew. My father had gotten orders, and we had to move 2 weeks into my senior year without an older brother/friend to go with me. Now, here's what I realized that senior year. When you move as like a third grader to someplace, third graders are much more adept at welcoming in new people. When you move somewhere as a senior, groups and friend groups are already formed. So as a senior, I experienced something I never had experienced up to that point, and that is abject loneliness. I just could not get in. And looking back, I realized that the 2 ulcers I developed over that senior year in high school was because of the loneliness and the lack of community that I had. I realized then that as much as I like dogs, and Milo and Sam became my 2 and only 2 friends that entire year, I was made for people, and the lack of people in close proximity was doing me harm. Do you all understand what I'm saying? Well, fortunately, after my senior year, you become a freshman again, and you go to college, and you get to choose where you go. So my brother, the aforementioned Jason, had gone up to Central Michigan University, and whenever I mention that here in Western Country, I always apologize when I say I chose to follow him, and I became a Chippewa for 1 year. And during that 1 year, I re-entered into something really rich and beautiful, and that rich and beautiful thing was community, friendship. And I realized, man, that senior year was horrible, and I realized it was horrible in light of the beauty of this freshman year with the richness of friends. Does anybody in the room, if I may call this a room, have any friends that you're thankful for? If you do, clap your hand. Well, for some crazy reason, I decided to only stay at Central Michigan 1 year. Some of you Broncos, are there any Broncos or Western graduates in the room? Yeah. All right, here comes that train. We're going to take a pause when that train gets here. Maybe it was wisdom. Maybe it was the Lord delivered me from Egypt, and I left Central Michigan, and I went to Ferris State University where I had a basketball scholarship waiting for me. And although basketball was back on the table, you know what I left behind at Central Michigan University? Community. I left it behind. I want you all to repeat after me. Not good. And so here's something that happened at Ferris State University. I developed a dichotomy in my life. I had my basketball friends who shared the interests and hobbies that I did. But their non-basketball activities were, shall we say, less than savory because they did not share a commitment to the Lord that I had even as a sophomore in college. Conversely, I went to a Christian group, Fellowship of Christian Students, and although we shared moralities and a faith, we did not share interest and hobbies. And so I kind of fit in this group, but not really. And I kind of fit in this group, but not really. Bobby, that train is for you. Wave to the train. And so, having 2 groups where I kind of fit in but really didn't fit in actually reminded me that there was no group that I actually fit in, and the lack of community was deadly. It was horrible. It was miserable. Thank goodness school was not year-round, and I began to work at a camp in the summer, Cran Hill Ranch. Happened to meet a young lady named Christy Kronemeyer and a few other friends. Shout out to Cran Hill, Christy. Yeah. And while there, that longing for community was met again as we served the Lord together and doing our things, had a lot of fun, a lot of laughter, a lot of depth. Unfortunately, the summer only lasts so long, and I had to go back to Ferris. So for 3 years on and off, there was a lack of community, and it was just lonely. Now, here's what I realized by the time I was at Ferris State University. When I realized I didn't fit here and I didn't fit here, and I look back on my time in my senior year in upstate New York when we had to move as a senior in high school, I began to do something when I didn't find community instantly. I began to withdraw, and I began to hide. And I began to spend all time alone, and I began to put on a mantle of this thing that I actually used to make myself feel better, but I don't think it was actually true. I began to put on the mantle that said, you know what I am? What do you think I began to call myself? I'm an introvert. And in reality, looking back through the lens of health and time, I was not an introvert. I was just lonely, and I justified not feeling bad about being lonely by saying I am an introvert. Well, I graduated from Ferris, and I went to Western Theological Seminary. And by that time, Christy and I were married, and so we had some built-in community right there, a wife right there to keep you happy. But unfortunately, Christy couldn't go to class with me all day because she had a job teaching preschool. But at Western Seminary, I entered into a friendship like I'd never had before with a guy named Mike. Now, what happened over the next 3 years was the depth of community that I think I had always longed for but never had before. Our friendship was so rich. At the end of our 3 years at seminary, 2 things happened, and I've shared this before, but it's been a while. Some of you have not heard this part of the story. At the end of our 3 years of seminary, Mike and I had basically spent every class together. We registered together. We spent time together. It was Christy, me, and Mike always hanging out. One thing that happened at the end of those 3 years is we were formally accused of cheating off of one another. And it was clear that we were cheating because we had taken every class together for 3 years. So at the end of 3 years, before we could graduate, we had to bring in 3 years' worth of homework to the dean of students' desk and let him and 2 other professors sort through our work over the weekend before they would clear us to graduate. Whew. I'll be honest, I didn't remotely feel bad for these poor suckers who had to, go through the different work because it was stupid. They had no concept for friendship that was deep and rich. Therefore, they had to put something negative on it. It couldn't be that they were just in rich community. They must have nefarious goals. They must be cheaters. A second thing happened. The seminary, after they cleared us of cheating, because clearly our styles of homework were very different, they saw the richness of community that Mike and I had together, and they weren't cheating, the seminary said, but somebody snuck to the seminary dean of students, and they said, well, Mike and Rob, how many of you know what I'm about ready to say? Yeah. Must be gay lovers. Jerry's laughing. As well you should, Jerry. They had no concept for 2 dudes who just had rich community the way that Mike and I did. So they must be gay lovers. So they brought us under a formal hearing with a bunch of faculty members before, and we sat before them, and they grilled us on whether or not we were gay. And if we passed, we would be able to graduate. If we didn't, we wouldn't be able to graduate. And it was just horrible. However, those 2 crazy things notwithstanding, the richness of community was delightful. And it was so rich, even in a seminary community, they had no concept of what the rich community could be. When I graduated from seminary, I began to work at a church here in town in 1996. And in 1996, when I began to work at a church in town, I realized that working at a church isn't all that I had thought it would be. And life got difficult and life got hard, and I realized I did not fit in the church that I thought I would fit in. And therefore, the community that I longed for was no longer present. Mike actually went to work at a church in Iowa, and here I was in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And although Christy and I had our lives together, during the day, when she was doing her thing at work as a teacher at Portage West Middle School. Remember those days, Christy? Portage West Middle School. I was left home alone or at work alone, not quite fitting in the environment that God had placed me in. And once again, I found myself lonely. And during that stretch of loneliness, I again found myself, looking back, withdrawing from the world and putting on the mantle of introvert. And not only did I find myself being lonely, not fitting in the community because I didn't look right, talk right, act right, I began to develop some woundings and some hurt from the world that I lived in. And out of my insecurities, get this, out of insecurities, I began to hold tight to the mantle of introvert. And I began to realize in my own head, I now believe this to not be true, but in my mind back then, because the community was broken, I didn't have community at work like I'd always hoped to have, I felt like I had absolutely nothing to offer. Has anybody ever felt that way? And because I felt that way, because my insecurities were high, I began to wear this false mantle of introvert. And as I've processed through life since those days, and as I've gone through hours and hours of therapy, I realize that I'm less of an introvert and I'm more of someone with insecurities. And whenever the introvert side rises up, I realize it's when my insecurities are actually rising up. And in the times of my life, as I look back on them, when insecurities are low, I realize that community is high. And when community is low, insecurities are high, and I pretend to be an introvert when in reality I'm not an introvert. I'm simply insecure. We find ourselves in a very weird time here during COVID, when the closest we can get to people is 6 feet, and we have to have a mask on. And when the sun is out and we got a mask and sunglasses, you don't know if that person is actually sleeping or listening to you preaching, right? This time that we find ourselves in as America is every bit as dangerous to community as my senior year in upstate New York, or those first years in Kalamazoo in 1996. And so we're going to do something to make sure that you experience a little community this morning. Now, what I'm going to do here in a moment, and the reason we don't have Shayla and Robbie up here, is because we want to use some of our time today to do something that we haven't been able to do for a bit. So it's going to make those of you who are truly introverts uncomfortable. I'm thinking, should I actually pretend to be sorry or be honest and say I'm not sorry, because it's going to be good for you to be stretched. I don't know if I am sorry, but I do empathize and understand for the following thing you're about ready to do. For those of you who aren't introverts, we're going to call on you to help us out. And I'm going to actually say some of you who think you're introverts actually are not introverts, you're just wounded and insecure. Back to my friend Mike, who lives in Iowa. He actually visited Christy and I and the kids years ago with his family. And one thing they introduced to our family, Christy, I don't even know if you remember, this came from the Van Rees family. The night before they left, we're sitting around the living room chatting, and Mike said, hey, why don't we just go around the room and share our highs and lows of the week? And so what we did is we went around the room and we shared our highs and our lows of the week. Since then, I don't know, maybe 10 years now, at most family dinners, when the Link family sits down to have dinner, we go around the table with high lows. Now, one of our daughters, Elise over here, had a group of girls over a bit ago, and I'm coming up from the basement, going upstairs to our bedroom, and I hear her friend Renee say, Renee has been to our house a number of times, she said to a table full of 13-year-old girls, hey girls, let's do high-lows and go around the table. And so there they were, a group of 13-year-old girls sharing high-lows, and in so doing, experience a little level of deeper community. Are you ready to experience church in a little bit of a different way this morning? Okay, we got one person who's excited about this. Are you willing at least to let me push you to a bit of a different place with the promise that Shayla and Robbie will be back here next week? Are you ready for me to just push you just a little bit? Are you okay with that? Thank you. And after we do that, we'll get back to the Gospel of John today. After we do a little bit of community building, I will get back to the Gospel of John. I'll do some teaching on John, just like the old times, like we normally do. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to mask up, stand up, and find somebody. You could know this person. It doesn't have to be somebody new. And I want you to ask them, what are the high lows that you've had this past week? And share. Now here's a bit of a guideline. Some of you are talkers and you're going to talk the entire time. It's actually meant for you to listen as well as talk, because community only happens when it's a two-way street. You understand? Some of you aren't talkers and you're going to hope that person across from you does all the talking. Well, that's not fair. You need to talk as well. So it requires you to listen and to talk. Now, if you are old enough to hear my voice, you are old enough to engage in high lows. So we're going to do a few rounds of high lows. Here's the guidelines. Mask up, stand up, and stay 6 feet back. But what you can do from 6 feet away is ask somebody, what's your highs and your lows? Don't get too close. Don't touch one another. Keep your mask on. Move around and mingle for a little bit. And although it's just a brief touch into the waters of community, it is a touch into the waters of community. If you're watching online right now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to bust out your phone, and I want you to text somebody that you know and love and ask them, hey, Rob from church is asking me to ask you, what's a high of the week and a low? And I want you to ask 3 people at home via text. Get up, find one person, ask them their highs and their lows of the week.